Chris, you're on already. How are you?
Good, good. Just trying to learn more, emphasize more on Kali Linux. I didn't think I did that well. Well, I didn't do that well in NCL.
It's okay.
I
That's a
did
good practice.
475 points out
Oh,
of 18
that's good.
out of 1800. I have to work on the logs.
Mhm.
I didn't get any points on logs, so I think that's something I totally forgot. So I have to go back on that. I need to work. I did okay on the on I did okay on everything else. I did okay on what's that other one? Network analysis, but I
Mhm.
still need to. I still have to go back and do the Wireshark because there's still a few stuff that I know we did it in CIS27, but I just forgot. Find the
Yeah.
answers. Yeah.
You know, I showed you how to create your Kali Linux already, so you already have
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I have
Just
that.
go back and practice.
Yeah.
And you know, with Linux, with Kali, you have to be able to use everything in terminal. That way, you can save time. So if you can, you know, incorporate like to the capability to read files, right? Like use Vim to kind of read the files and be able to edit the file.
Yeah.
That would streamline a lot of the process, especially when you're trying to access like logs and things like that. Or
That's what
you can
Sean
use
told me.
Bash.
Yeah.
So that was something that we did briefly. We didn't, but I think I'm teaching CIS27A in the spring, which is risk analysis. We will come back to a lot of that.
Okay.
So that would have the CEH component, which is the ethical hacking, which we have its own class, but it will review some of that, and then we will look into how we can mitigate or reduce risk
Yeah.
by using some of the tools. So yeah, so CIS27A will touch on a lot of that too, looking at logs, looking at firewall, not just Windows firewall, but hopefully we'll be able to incorporate some of the activities there.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So I think two of you on. I think the other ones will probably be joining later. I know that 5 o'clock, it's Zoom is a little heavy sometimes. So if I turn my camera off, it's only because on my side sometimes I get a little lag on the connection. But no one's really on except for me. It's shared traffic, you know that. So all right. This week we're gonna touch on what we did in the lab last week, because I had you guys preview and use the practice lab to evaluate your email, because we talked about email last week, and in the lab it had you do email and web resources and access information. So we're going to touch a little bit more on details so you can have a sense of what to do and where to look when you come across a specific type of case. And all of this come back to application, which is the browser, and also some of it comes back to cloud, and you know, how do we deal with social media and cloud. So in the lab last week, you saw a little bit on how to use Facebook forensic, and that's one of the tools. But before you start analyzing content and things on social media, we have to talk about the legal aspect and how do you go about asking for that type of permission, because you know, there's public information that we can see from the user, but some of the private information we have to get permission to do that. Okay, so let's talk. If I just get this up, so if you can download the Unit 9 notes, sometime Canvas is a little bit delayed there. I tried to put in more screenshot on this one, and I try to break it down where it's easier using the assignment. So if you can download the notes and the assignment. So the focus in this week, we're going to talk about web activity, investigating web activity for specific user. And to start, what we have is it talks about how all web activity really ties back to application. And to begin, we're going to talk about browser applications. So let me go into screen share before I forget. Okay. And browser is essential. So people use browser on their smartphone, on their computer, on their tablet. And if you know where to look, you will find a lot of the details, not just what website they visited, but the data that pertains to that session. And that's what we're really looking at in forensic. So in the case where they submit a transaction illegally, right, to transfer from one account to another account overseas, likely that they would utilize some kind of application to do that, and we can see if that actually exists in browser. In the past, we talked about the case where a couple that was accused of child abuse, and these people, they started using search engine to look for consequences or illness of a certain type of physical abuse, and that kind of lead the investigator into finding more detail on some of the things that they were searching. So you do see a lot of the criminal-based case that would tie back to what we would investigate, and then you would also see some of the, the more general policy violation in the organization if you have to investigate as to build the case for the corporation that would tie back to the browser activity. So as we did the lab last week, you use different tools. So we're going to talk about some of the tools that the author introduced. And it's important to see what kind of tools would work best with some of these browser. So we know that Chrome is a very popular browser. Google branched off and they have Chromebooks, which has, and then you also have Chrome running on Android systems and Chrome running on Windows and other platforms. So Chrome is a popular browser, no doubt. So we need to know how to evaluate Chrome and where to look at the files for Chrome. So for web activity, we are going to mainly look at a few things. Bookmark is one of them, like what they add in as their bookmark so that way they can come back later. We need to take a look at the history, which is what website they visited, what kind of activity that they completed on the application. We need to take a look at the cache file. We've been spending time looking at RAM and also looking at cache file for the application. And we need to take a look at cookies. Cookies is important because it saved the session information, and with that we will have more information about the type of activities that they did. And then lastly, password, right? Password is essential because what if they use that password to encrypt data? Then what we do is we have to be able to make sure that I'm going to have everybody unmute for a second. So if you need to have questions, right, ask question, go ahead and unmute, okay? Password is used to decrypt data, so that's why it's important that we get that password information so that way we can go back and decrypt the necessary files that we find, okay? Or, password that's going to show us the type of login that they have for, transactions and activity. Sorry about my dog. Okay, so in Chrome, we are looking at Chrome artifacts. Now, you can find bookmarks information stored in Chrome's under user data, default, and bookmark, and that's under Chrome. So far we've been talking about a lot of these locations. So for Windows environment, it puts it under the Google directory, under the Chrome directory, under the user data. And then in the default directory, you will find bookmarks. Okay. Now, Chrome uses JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, which cannot be read in a regular standard manner. So what they say is even if you use a text reader, it's really hard to really see a lot of the details. Now, this is just a small snapshot, but if you're looking at a very large file, it can be very, very tedious. So when you open up the file, yes, you can use a text editor to look at this, but the best way to do this is to use a third-party tool, okay? And a third-party tool, it's gonna organize it for you so that way, number one, we're gonna see the timestamp for specific URL, the time that the bookmark was added. Okay, so and it could be that they visited that website many times, and on, you know, like maybe the 5th time that they would add it to the bookmark folder, that's going to store that URL. It's going to show you the date that it's added, the date that it's last visited on that system, and the name that they use, because sometimes the user don't just use the default name, they might put it under a different name to really hide it maybe, or a name that they wouldn't recognize. So the name that they use for the bookmark. So every time now when you bookmark your page on your smartphone or even on your computer, you know that this is stored, right? And we know that when information is stored, even when the user delete it, it doesn't necessarily go away right away. It will stay there until the data is overwritten. So in Chrome, to answer our question, it says what type of information that we should gather, what type of browser, right? So in Chrome, what we can do is we can find the bookmark file, and we can go in and we can look at the date that's added, the type, you know, the name that they use, and the website that they're accessing and they've added. So for the first question, it asks you, what type of files can a forensic investigator examine to identify unethical or critical internet activity of the user? We need to look at the browser logs. That's important, okay? We need to take a look at the files, and I mentioned to you, so I'm gonna add more to this. So we need to take a look at the history file, the cache file, the cookies, password files that's actually stored to that application. And then we also need to take a look at the bookmark. Okay, and that can be called different things across different browsers. However, it would mean the same thing if we're saying my favorites, you know, added to my favorites in Microsoft compared to adding it to a bookmark directory. So it will just store it into a folder, so that way they can go back and find, right, that added URL. So the browsers that we normally see now, currently, we would see Chrome as number 1, and then you see Safari on the OS X side, so on the Mac side, and you would see Firefox, and then Microsoft Edge. Now you got Opera and some of the other browsers that are not as common, and then many of the browsers are built on some of these major browsers. So what you see is a lot of the smartphone system, what they do is they take, right, what some of the existing browser, and then they would modify it to make it a version of that. So you would see a spin-off of Chrome right, in a different name, and it's going to look very similar to Chrome. So the source code is already there. What they do is they take that source code and they modify it and customize it and make it work. Now, you also have browser that are part of specific type of service. So for example, Facebook have their own type of search engine that they built, and then in some cases some application would have its own browser. You know, like BitTorrent would have their own search and their own browser option. So you can, once you install that app, what you will do is you would be able to utilize that app to search for certain things and browse certain things through that app. My cousin used to write some of the library for that particular area when he was at BitTorrent. So he educated me a little bit on it because I was not clear on whether it was piggybacking on some of this in existence, but he was telling me that now a lot of the applications are doing that. So for number 2, what we want to do is we want to mention that Chrome, Safari, Firefox, and Edge, and these are the 4 main ones, right? And then you do have some of the smaller group of users are using the other type of browser. Okay, any question? Okay, so in this session of our lecture, right, our class assignment, we want to focus on these areas, okay? And we're going to break it down for each one: Chrome, Firefox, and Edge. Okay, so as you saw in the first page of the note, where can you find the browser bookmark file? And this is for Chrome. That should be Chrome. Sorry, I didn't add that. So for Chrome, we wanted to look under the app data, local, Google, Chrome, user data, default bookmarks. So it's really buried inside the subdirectory under the app data for the user profile inside the Windows environment. And you would see similar in where it would buried in some of the subdirectory. If you're looking at, if you're running Chrome on Linux or Chrome OS, right, you would be able to navigate to the directory. So all of this is saved to the hard drive, and we can utilize that unless it was, you know, even if it's deleted, it will go into the unallocated partition like we talked about in the prior weeks. But it would tie to the application, so we can quickly find it by looking at that. Okay. Now in the bookmark file, you would find that we can locate the time that the time and date that that web page was added to the bookmark directory, when they last visited that web page, because even if it's added, right, it might not be the last time that they open up that web page, so, or that access that website. So what we can do is, because now it's able to index that, it's gonna identify when is the last time that they use it, so there's a timestamp on it. Then the name that's used for the bookmark, and also the URL itself. Okay, and with that, you're gonna see more. So we will take a look at some of the screenshot. So URL, timestamp, last visited, and the name that's used to store that bookmark. And every application would store it a little bit differently. So when you take a look at this compared to Edge or Firefox, it's slightly different. So if we know exactly where it is, we can go in and look at it. We can find it, and we can use a tool, right, from our image, of course, to be able to evaluate it. Okay. Any question on 1 through 4? You can find this on page 2, right? Question 4 is on page 2 of your notes. So here it shows you what it kind of looked like, where you would have the subdirectory, and it's gonna break it down. So under the in the JSON file, what you have is you would have the root directory, and then it's gonna break it down to the subdirectory, which it calls children. And in that you would see right here, date added, date modified, the ID, the name that they gave it, sync transaction between the device and the web server, and then also additional data with that. Okay, so I would be able to get a lot of the details from the children directory when I expand it. Okay, like this. So it gives us the URL, right? The information on that particular bookmark. Now, how do they get it to look like this? Because we know that with the JSON file, it can only be opened up in text editor if we don't have other applications. So it is suggested that we would use Decode, which is a third-party open source application, and you can find the link there. So Decode allows us to decipher or decode, as the name says, the information about the timestamp. Okay, so it's gonna, because the way Google has it is that they had written the code to set it up as a certain value for that timestamp, and we would need to take that value and convert it to UTC, which is your universal time, right? So that way we can document it as this is the last time that they access, and this is the time that it was added. So you would use decode to decipher the timestamp. Okay, because when you look at this value, it doesn't really give us anything, right? We don't see the year, we don't see the time window, the hour, the minutes, the day. So we need to convert it. Okay, so keep in mind that for Google Chrome, you have to do that. You have to use another tool to be able to analyze it. Okay, now we can go further and start looking at the history of the access, right, of the user, of the web activity. And so what are some of the things that we can look at? We can look at downloads, right? So it will tell us what they downloaded and where, and that's important. Because in the case where if you're investigating illegal downloading, right, like and redistributing that download, then that's illegal. So we can investigate the type of downloads that that user had, and where is it stored? Is it stored locally? So for if they're using Chrome, first it would, if you click download on Chrome, what will happen? It's gonna throw it into the downloads folder, right? If it's Windows, and for most of the OS. So unless, and then the user would then move it into a different location, so it would give you the path of the file where that would be saved at the download time. Also the time that the start of the download and the end of the download or pause, and the size. All of this ties back to the system log, because that would be an operation or a process that's happening in the back. So also we can also look at what they're searching for. Like going back to my example earlier, in the case where the couple abused their kids, they were searching for how to fix or cure some of the ailment from physical abuse. Okay, so keyword search. Now, you know, the question came up last time, what if you go incognito, right, in Chrome? Your system still stores some of that information. Some of your information might not be shared. So there are certain things that Google actually have you set so you can have it set a certain way. But for most of the time with the default Chrome, we can gather a lot of the information. The URL, the website they visited, that they would type into the address bar. And then the history, which is the website that they visited, the number of times that they visited. Okay. So for the decode, earlier we saw that huge long value. It will break it down. It will calculate this for us, and it's going to tell us that this was Saturday, April 16th of 2016, and this is the time. And we want UTC time, so that way it will be the same across instead of using time zone in specific. Okay? Any question? So if you want to practice, the best practice too at home is to create an image of your system and then to start using some of these tools to start looking at your own web traffic, right? Your own files that you downloaded, and so that way you can be familiar with how it should look like outside of just a practice lab. Okay, we'll do some of that in the project that's coming up soon. So once you have the timestamp from the Chrome bookmarks, you would use decode to interpret that timestamp value, because it will be difficult for us to determine what that is without a third-party application. Now, as I touch on what we can gather from the Chrome history file, we talked about downloads, right? Keyword search, history. As in the website that they visited. So for number 6, we can list those. And from a forensic standpoint, everything is very transparent, really. You know, every activity, every single process that's really committed, that's associated with the user activity, it will be logged, it would be stored. And in the case where some of it were deleted, we can still find fragment of it to kind of piece together some part of the picture. But we will have to dig more to really get more of the, you know, a better picture of what had happened. So in the case where if they haven't deleted much, if the files and all the history is still there, we can spend the time to really draw everything out, build it from the artifacts, and put together a bigger picture. Okay, any question? So this particular chapter, like all the other chapters, is very relevant to what you see. And, you know, we cannot really move away from using the web. It's really hard for someone to do that now, because people have to work and people have to be able to communicate. So internet traffic and internet activity is a big core in our lives, and it's going to continue to be like that. Okay, so be excellent in this area. That's going to make you a really good forensic technician and specialist. Okay, so before we get to the next part, let me move it back up to there in case you're still typing some of it. Let's talk about cookies. and some other areas of Chrome. Okay, so here's some example that shows you, right, the history file. It would look like this from a Windows system. It shows you, okay, the download information, the timestamp, when it starts, when it ends, then also some search information. And when you see Thunderbird, last week we talked about Thunderbird already, so that will be used with mail. So we know that from here we can see that yes, there was Gmail that was used, Thunderbird that's used. So that gives us lead into the next part of the investigation. We can look further into Gmail and we can look further into Thunderbird, right? Going back to last week lecture. Okay. And then the website they visited, also to Yahoo, also another webmail. Okay. So with this, what we can do is we can go in further and we can start looking at Chrome cookies. So cookies is designed to track activities, and many companies use it for advertisement purposes, right? To give you the right product advertisement, to give you the right user experience. So say, okay, that's arguable. So for many companies like Amazon and you know, you name it, a lot of, like, even, you know, some of the retail store locally, when you access their website, right, they want to know where you located, who you are, you want to share that information or not, and if you install the app, you have to allow them to access other resources. So if you're using Chrome alone, not their own app, what you have is the cookie is really stored to a location. Okay. And this, if we're using it alone, we cannot make it a conclusive evidence, because the user is knowingly visited the website and you have to have other supporting artifacts. So if you plan to use cookies alone, that's not going to withstand in court. So what you want is you want to analyze it and be able to use it as one component of many in the evidence. So the cookie location is found here, okay, under Google Chrome user data and default. And this is a screenshot from X-Way. So X-Way shows, right, like what we've seen also in the history area, it shows that their cookies pertain to these sites. And again, we have the timestamp, okay? While you can see some of it, but what you should do is they created a tool for this to make it look better and to interpret the data better. So you should use a tool called Chrome Cookies View by Nearsoft. This will allow us to parse the data and make it readable, okay? Now, in our report, we don't have to put in a lot of the screen capture. You have to take what the data is and explain what it means. Such as, you know, in this case, we saved the cookie for the user accessing that website. So we can say that the user last accessed this at this time because there's cookie evidence showing this. Also, there is cache history showing this, right? So you notice that here we had a hard time looking at the timestamp, and the application is going to give us a better timestamp here. more readable. Same value, okay? And it tells you the expiration of the cookies. And some site, they have no expiration, right? And some website, for security reasons, they have an expiration of the cookies. So in the case if that cookie was captured or intercepted, then the user outside of that scope, the user won't be able to, other unauthorized people won't be able to access that. Okay. So that's a screen capture from that. And we want to use this to get a more clear understanding. Now for the cache, you also use, so this company, they produce like a suite to read these things, right? To evaluate browser information. So you can use Chrome Cache View to convert the data so that way it's clear. And this is cache, not cookies, okay? The earlier one, the one prior was cookies. So cache data basically store, okay, again, access timestamp of that website, but it also gives you what? It also gives you protocol and services that's tied to that protocol to that particular service provider or that web server, okay? That server system, and the IP address. So let's answer the next few questions. So what type of information can you find in examination of cookies? We can find user activities, and that could be a wide range of different things. So simply just doing online shopping, so cart information is stored there. There would be other things, transactions, sessions on the visitor website, such as shopping cart, transaction, etc. I think I had this spell. Let me fix the spelling on that. And within that, we would find URL, server IP, or destination IP, I should say, right? But this would be your server, because you have to connect through the web server to be able to get the page. And then session services, data type, and timestamp. And to find our cookies, this is the path for our cookies. So when you view the cookies file, you can also use the text editor for Chrome. We can view it as text, but it's difficult to really get all the detail, all the data. So we would be considering using a third-party tool, which is Nearsoft Chrome Cookies View. Okay. Any questions? I like using Chrome for the majority of things, and then I would use Firefox for other things. I do have Opera installed for, but I found that there are many sites that would be supporting Chrome because it's a popular browser application compared to other type of browser. So you would see Chrome and Firefox are well supported. So they code it to specific browser, right? And if you learn JavaScript or web-based languages, there's a way that we can find out what type of browser the user is using to access our web page. Now, in the case where it's not coded to a certain browser, the web pages would not load the proper format. So the user might lose some of the functionality. Even though it's in HTML, there's some stuff that could come from in JavaScript or other languages. It would come across and you would lose those features, so the user won't have the full experience. So what you would have is you want to code it for the major mainstream browser, because, you know, considering what type of device they're using to connect, either the iPhone, the Android, you know, desktop PC, etc. So that's why you see it as they're both well supported. And then you have Edge, like Canvas. There's some feature that Canvas works so well with, like on Chrome and then or Firefox, and then it would lose out a little bit on Microsoft Edge. So that's what you see. Okay. Now for our cache view, we already talked about this from our notes. You would use also Nearsoft, and that will be your Chrome cache view. So for the Chrome, we can download those tools, and you can have those, the software tool ready and equipped, right, to be able to analyze that image. If you know that you have an idea that the user is using Chrome, we can't say no. We just we suspect that the user is using Chrome. Okay, question? As I mentioned shortly before, we talked about how we should gather passwords. Okay, so here's a little snapshot of what that would look like, right? It shows you the server information, the tag, the IP address, the lane. And yes, we can pull some of this from the network traffic too, but we want to look at the system. This is in the system itself, the image of it. For passwords, password is used for encryption and decryption. It's used for, you know, accessing files that could be file password protected. Like for example, I might have a PDF that's password protected, and I would send that to my coworkers who need some kind of essential information on it. So I would have the password provided for that individual, but in the case we need to retrieve it, that's important because that will give us more access to some additional information. So that's why it's important. And it's also located in the same location as the others. So you would find it under default. So there is a utility in Nearsoft called Chrome Pass that allows you to decrypt the password. Okay. So for the next question, number 11, it asks you, why should a digital investigator recover users' web-based password? In case we need to decrypt the data that they encrypted, in case we need to access file, and with that we can gather more information about their activities. Okay, any question on passwords or cache or cookies? And in OS Forensic in Practice Lab, right, it has some feature, but you're not using a full suite also. So when you search for that, you do see some bits and pieces, like looking at email, and then if you're using Pro Discovery, you see some part of it. But there are additional tools, that's what we're trying to tell you, that would be also useful when you're looking at that specific file. Okay. Where can you locate the password? This is the directory where you can find it. And you can find this information on page 5 of our notes. Okay. And earlier we talked about cookies and tools. So I meant, sorry, this should be password right here. I don't know why I typed cookies there. So for 13, that would be password. So you would use Nearsoft Chrome Pass to evaluate the password. As you would do if you would use Nearsoft Cookie View to evaluate cookies, right? So it is a very useful software. And with it, you know, unlike some of the forensic tool, right? Many of the forensic tool has UI, the user interface, but some of the forensic tool we've seen in the past when we're analyzing RAM, it's only using terminal, like dump it. So this one has a graphical user interface and it kind of lay out some of the details a little bit better. So you can use it to do that. Okay. Any question? Okay, so the next part we're going to talk about Microsoft Edge and then Firefox, and then we're going to touch on file sharing and cloud and social media last. Those areas are last. So for the Edge, Microsoft Edge, that's the next part in your notes on page 5. So Microsoft has fully transitioned to Edge and they just released a new version of Edge, as a matter of fact, this year. And this has, you know, they moved away from Internet Explorer in that Internet Explorer had a lot of the weaknesses. Internet Explorer had vulnerabilities. And even when they patch it, it seems to have a lot of issues. So they re-release it and they call it Edge, especially in the Windows 10 era. So at the beginning of Windows 10, at the end of Windows 7, they decided that they should rename it, built it, and have some of the functionality that's a little bit different. They took on different design approach as what you've seen with Google, where they understood that the user started to search for more things like how they would Google everything. So what they did was they went back and restructure it because the Internet Explorer in the past had some functionality that was not found to be useful to some of the users. Then you have other add-on issues that create challenges for developer and also user who's using the application. So when you add bookmarks to Edge or IE, you would see that Microsoft call it as favorites. So you add it to your favorites, okay? And so it ties to the favorites area of that user profile. That's what we touch on in chapter 6. Now, the commercial forensic tool, like as you've seen when you did your lab, it's going to give you something like this, a list, okay, as in URL. So with that, what we can do is we can take little part of it and we can look at what type of website that they added as their favorites, right? Just like how we would evaluate it, this in Chrome. So we can drill down on specific area of that file. Now, important things that you need to note is that Internet Explorer only store 20 days activity by default. Now, that can also change. The user can configure that in the settings for that browser. So a lot of the things we talked so far is by default, right? And the user can make adjustment in the location and the time that they store these things. So from chapter 6, where we talk about how we will look at different areas of the Windows environment or the Windows operating system, this is kind of revert back to that chapter in that it ties in that Edge and IE would store this in a specific location. So for Windows 10, it puts the cache information in web cache. And what you need to do is you need to use a forensic tool to look at that database. So we can use ESE, and it would give you a specific path to each of the component of that file, of the cache information. So in the Windows cache, what we got is we got cookies, history, right? We have things that would tie to that, to the sites and the user web activity. It tells you the path, the directory where that will be stored. So in the next question, when investigating Microsoft Edge, you can find the bookmark files. It would be under favorites, or it would be in web cache data. So for Internet Explorer, it stores your web history for 20 days. And keep that in mind, because when we're out of that scope, by default, right, we have to start looking further because it might not be there after 20 days. So that gives you a little bit under 3 weeks. And for our cache file, we would find that under App Data, Local Microsoft Windows Web Cache. Question? Okay. So touching back to this, all of that information is on 5 and 6. So now when we go and look at the container that is stored, okay, we can start looking at specific file. So if we're looking at the history, what it's going to do is going to give you the subdirectory for the weeks and the days. Okay. So here what we see is this example, they have it where under that history, we would have it broken down into 2 separate days that they access that particular web page. Okay. So you have to navigate down to the days. Now what you can do is you can take the decimal number and then you can convert it to hexadecimal. And then use the decode to get the timestamp. So how do I convert it to hexadecimal? Well, your Windows or most system, all OSs have the calculator to do this. You can also install an app. So in the Windows environment, right, you can access the programmer calculator. You can input that decimal value in and then click hex, and it should show you the hex value. Take that hex value and use the decode, okay? You can manually convert it, but that would take up a lot of time. So when I teach CIS 7 or 11, I tell the student, this is, you know, it's useful in addresses and it's useful for a lot of different things in the system. So now you can see that it's applied. So once we get it to the hex value, we can use decode to convert the hex value, because that's what we need to get our date. So different than Chrome, Microsoft store that timestamp as decimal value. Chrome stores that, you know, as hex value, where you can just bring that in. But in the case where you see an application that stores it as a decimal value, you can use a third-party tool like this to calculate to show the timestamp. So it shows here that that was Thursday, the 29th of August, 2019 at this time, 17/31/19. Okay. Any question? Okay. Then in the cache portion, what if they type in a website, right? Like they would go to a .com or a .org, a website, a URL. So it would also store that, and it would list it each, okay? So the top ones are the most recent one. So that's the, by default, if you don't filter it or index it, what it will do is going to give you the most recent one on top. And it's going to maintain 50 at a time. Because the way the system is designed is that it's allocating that space for so many URL, right? Now, it depends. The system administrator can configure a specific system to have more or less storage for specific things. So by default, we know that we would have 50 of the more recent URL that would be stored. So the last 50 that they have. And then as it gets to, you know, if you have more added, it will override some of the old ones. So it will flush that out. Now, we know that the system would move it to a certain location, so you need to go back to the registry and start looking at, right, how it would transition those out. And we talked about that in chapter 6. So here is a snapshot of what that would be in your registry editor, so your reg edit. And this is what we see. That will be your type URL. So it shows you the URL itself, the time, the hooks. Question? Okay. So additional for Edge and Internet Explorer cache, right? In the case where they download pictures, if they're watching videos, that's very transparent. Okay. So this, the cache viewer from Nearsoft is going to give you a listing like this. It shows the type of file that they access, the data that they access for that event. Okay. And the URL, the timestamp, and the expiration. So this is your cache view. Then in your cookies, we can go further and look at the cookies information. It's a text file, so you can use a text editor to read it, or you can use a third-party tool to read it. So in the next few questions, it asks you, how do you analyze Microsoft Edge cache file, right? First, you would import the image. Remember, we don't touch the real system. We create the image from it. Then we would import that image and use forensic tool to analyze the file by index. We can look at registry editor, right? And you did this in the lab last time. So we treat it as file and we'll use forensic tool to look at the file. Let me move this down to the next page so I can show you the next view. Sorry. Then in Windows 10, how many URLs are stored in the history file and cache? That will be 50. Most recent 50. Where can you find the cookies file for Edge? And we would find it here. It's under local, a little bit different than the other ones. Packages, Microsoft Edge, AC, Microsoft Edge, and then cookies. So it's buried within some of the subdirectory there. Okay, so just like Chrome, we need to take a look at the cookies, the cache, the history, the type URL, the whole works. Okay, so you can find the path for that on page 8. Now with password for the sessions, right, Microsoft does store, and Microsoft has specific format for, you know that all passwords stored on Windows, and in Windows environment, it's stored encrypted. But it doesn't always mean that we cannot see it. There are tools that we would use by analyzing the image. You saw that already when we're looking at Chrome. And so, yes, you can find some of the password information. And from a network standpoint, we can see some of that pretty transparent as well. Like if you're looking at some of the network forensic tool, like Network Miner, like we did that in the first week, you see the user account information, some of the password they use to log into the network, especially if it's a network profile, right? So, all right. Next, we're going to talk about Firefox. And Mozilla is the company, the organization that maintains Firefox. So Firefox keep things in profile. And so it's going to be a little bit simpler to look at compared to the other ones. Now the path where you can find the profile is here. So that's under App Data, Local, Mozilla, and then Firefox. And we're looking at Windows PC with this path. Okay. So in that directory, you would see the profile. And it tells you that it creates a random alphanumeric 8-digit prefix for the user and following the username. So it throws in these values that's attached to the username. Now, if they don't have additional account, if you're using default, that will be your default username. So when you're looking at the Firefox, the profiles here, right, it's going to add in some of the profile information. So as you can see here, that's what they're talking about, which is the prefix value and then the username and the prefix value and the default account. So the user has this profile, bad guy needs love, and then another profile called bad guy, and it adds the prefix. Okay. That's an example. So for the profile, you can find it in the profiles ini or the profile ini file. And we would use, so when you open it up, right, the best is to look at some of the capability from the other forensic tool to open it up. But you can find that there. Okay. With the cache, it's also under the profile, so no point to go back and see if it's a different path. It's the same path. And the file path remains the same. You would use Cache Viewer from Nearsoft to look at the content. Okay. And it would be, these just kind of show the subdirectory underneath for each of the profile. And the cookies, you can use MZ cookies view, which allows you to view Firefox cookies. And it's also under the profile, but underneath that you also have a local folder. Now there are two different profiles. There's the roaming profile and there's a local. Local pertains to that system, and roaming is if they are more at large in the network, so it needs to sync. So for the cookies, there's two locations that you need to look at. Okay, so let's answer the question. So we talked about profile in Firefox. That's under Mozilla Firefox, under app data and local. And the tool that you would use to view the cookies is the MZ Cookies View, which is from Nearsoft. Okay, any question relating to Mozilla Firefox? So by this point, we covered a lot, from looking at files to hard drive to web activities to history to cookies to cloud, right? You did a lab on Dropbox, and to looking at cloud. Just to touch a little bit more on Firefox. So this is what it would look like if you're looking at the history from Firefox. Similar to the other one, but on this one, it shows you the visit count. So you can see how often they access that website. Okay, the timestamp is there, the URL is there. Now we can also use a tool to acquire safe password to that browser. So if I click, let's say I use Firefox and I'm trying to access Canvas. After I put in my username and password, it's going to prompt me, do I want to save the password? And many people click save so they don't have to retype it. That can be retrieved. So you would use Password Fox utility from Nearsoft to retrieve the password, and it comes in as plain text like this. Okay, so we can see that for the bad guys need love at Gmail, the password for that account is password. Okay, so good tool to use there, and we can use the password to access other resources to look for more information. Any question? And again, we're using the same type of software for our, so from Nearsoft, we can use the Fave view to look at the bookmarks in Firefox. So bookmark would look like this. So if you have a user that uses 3, 4, 5 browsers, then you have to start looking at each of the browser. And as you do it, you would document, right? So that way it becomes more of a tedious task. However, you would get bigger picture, because I'm, very similar to many other users out there, like you and other users. I use multiple browsers for different things, right? Some part of the canvas I use Chrome, some part I would use Firefox. When I set up your practice lab, I have to use other browser except for Chrome. Chrome doesn't do well when I'm trying to link the actual module to Canvas with the API, so I have to log in Firefox. And I couldn't do that for the new Edge because the way that developer created the code, it stopped working with the new Edge. So I have to use Firefox only before I was able to use Edge. So you do see that, people switch back and forth. Give me 1 second, let me hit the lights. Okay, any question on Firefox? Let's talk about social media. And there are some existing tools, open source and commercial, that allows us to access social media profile. Now you got to be really careful using those tools, because when we touch cloud environment, social media storage, we really have to take a look at the property, where, who has jurisdiction over that profile, that storage, that user account. And even for companies that are overseas, right? Like when we're talking about in a different continent, how the regulation will govern, because the data is in their physical server elsewhere in the world, right? In the country, in some part of the world. Then it becomes an area of where that's physically stored, which company owns it, because even if it belongs to the user, the company is in charge of maintaining it, then we have to get their permission to access it. So when you did your discussion during the first week, you saw that Cloudflare, they host stuff for other entity, right? Like, and ISIS contracted Cloudflare to host their resources. Now, Cloudflare came back and said, well, it's on our system. We're going to try to protect it. It's fair, but how is the rules going to change from one area to the next? So in forensic, it's important to look at that, okay? Now, when you're investigating social media, we know that we need to take a look at the mainstream social media sites like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, etc. And that can change from one period to the next. So it's more challenging to really look at social media compared to if we're investigating the system, because it's very fluid, right? It can be hot one minute and not hot the next, right? So look at like MySpace, how that went out and that changed in the use over time. Okay. Now Reddit is also a social media. LinkedIn is social media, right? So gathering that is a little bit different than gathering artifacts from the system. Okay. So here it talks about dealing with the change. And the goal is for you to keep current with what's in and what's being used. I was watching a documentary the other day about, I think it's called An American Murder or An American Murder. It's about a husband that killed his wife. And he, you know, and two children. And he put their body near his work. And this was a case that was ongoing for a long time. And the parents, they decided to allow companies, media companies, to make a documentary and release it. And I saw it on Netflix. It was very interesting. So the wife, the spouse, she had documented most of her life using social media. And the documentary company, the media company, was able to pull a lot of that because it was public. Video clips that she uploaded on Instagram, and they got authorization to pull text messages from husband and wife and friends, right? From, you know, based on the family authorization, and also because the husband, he lost his rights, so they were able to pull some of that. And they had to get their service, the service provider, to release the text messages and all the media. But you can see the timeline. And when I was watching it, I was thinking about this class because they pieced together a picture of her by showing you what she had posted on social media about her children, about her marriage, about her family life, about her work. Okay? So the digital evidence that you're investigating can come from social media, and that can give you a picture of the user activity in that investigation. And I think here we only list the things that are popular in general. And you also need to take a look at the country. So let's say that if you're investigating a case that would pertain to a user in a specific country, and that country can have a different use of a different site, like a social media site. Like in Canada, that might be a little bit different than us. In China, that will be different than us, right? In Australia, that will be different than us. So it's important to really be aware of the type of social media that's being used. Okay. Like here, it talks about Kik, right? And compared to like Reddit, Twitter, etc. So a tool that we would use to extract or use after we extract the image is the bulk extractor. We talked about this last time when we talked about RAM and evaluating systems, right? So we have to use bulk extractor. You really have to pull that from memory. And most of the time people on social media on their smartphone, smart devices, compared to what you see with more like system. But yes, they do use their desktop computer at work and at home and laptop to also access social media as well. Now, in the case where we have to get company to release the data, right, after we get court authorization or warrant, you would use a website called search.org. It gives you a list of service provider and their contact information. So you can reach out to their legal department and get appropriate authorization. Okay. So like the example that we use here is Kik, and Kik use a separate website for that type of things. So you have to submit information to that website, and their legal team will contact you and provide the information if you've given them all the proper paperwork. And that can be a long period of time or short. It all depends on how much of the paperwork you already have prepared and how responsive they are. So there are other factors that are played into that. So to answer the next question, it asks you for 22, in digital forensic investigation, why is social media important? Why is it difficult to find social media artifacts? In general, we can say that social media contains a lot of information about the user, such as user location. Most of these apps would tie the user to certain location when people check in, right? Even on Yelp or on some of the social media based app, on Facebook, on Instagram, it would tie to some of the user activity and files, and that can be stored in a different in the provider's server. Okay, and also if the profile has privacy configuration, then we have to get authorization. Now earlier we talked about obtaining the warrant if we're working with law enforcement and such. That's if they don't authorize us. Sometimes you can ask the permission to access it. And in the case where I mentioned I watched a documentary, the family allows these company to go in and look at, access her profile. So they sign off the waiver on that, and so they were able to retrieve that with the service provider. And then when it becomes, a murder investigation, right? The husband also have to waive his right to give up, his phone. And how they really pinned him was he failed the lie detecting test, but they could not use the lie detecting test in court. So what they ended up is that they have his family member convince him to admit to the guilt. And he came after a week or so, a couple of weeks, he came forward and he said he admitted that he killed the family member, his wife and his children. So the files that are used to store that's used by the user or uploaded by the user could be stored on the service provider servers. So you have to get their permissions to access those files. Okay, and you would have a window of time to do that, or they would be able to send you, that profile content only. And when you do the forensic, remember that we can usually they only give you access to that user profile. However, right, in the case where it's linked to other individual, if we only have jurisdiction for that profile, we only get granted permission for that profile. We would only investigate that profile. We don't look beyond, even if we could. Right? That's unethical. It's against our rule. We don't do that. Okay. The tool that you would use is your bulk extractor. Question?
Yeah, you can't do that also because it can be used. It cannot be used in court, or
Right. And it also, in the case where if you are state certified or nationally certified as an investigator, they can strip away your certifications because it's unethical practice. So in the case, even if you see something wrong, you cannot mention it or document it. You're not supposed to see it. And that's the same thing with ethical hacking. And it's the same practice with forensic. So even if you see it, because yes, you cannot legally use it in court, but you cannot tie that into, you know, because you're not allowed to really look in additional information outside of that scope. And private company, when they contract you, they are very clear about what they want. So if they're telling you that you're only going to look at one email account for that user, that's what you're going to look. Because when you sign that dotted line for your contract, if you violate that, not that they don't pay you, but they can come back and sue you. So be very careful with that. And don't do anything until you sign and they sign. And you have, you know, both legal team look at that. So I would have like an advisor look at my contract before I commit to a certain service, because some costs in there that might cover them, but it might jeopardize your profession. So you have to be careful. Even if you're hired by the company, right, you have to look at your scope, your work scope. Okay, so that's just an advice for everybody in general. Okay, search.org we would use, bulk extractor we would use. So when we're looking at Twitter profile, if you have a forensic tool that can look at the Twitter, you saw how the Facebook forensic one, you have to log into Facebook in order to look at Facebook, right? That's the requirement. Now, if Facebook authorizes you to access that account, if they open it up or they give you the files for that account, then that's a different story. Okay, so you have to go and get them to authorize you to do that in such case. Now the artifacts can be on their domain, and sometimes they can refuse, and that can go back and forth for a long time. Then you have to get your legal team to be involved, and then you have to get law enforcement to be involved, and then they would have to require that, you know, subpoena that, and so it can get pretty hairy because most people don't give up their data quickly. Okay, you saw what happened even with Facebook case. See how long that dragged out to be? You know, internally, and when they dealt with the data privacy and the voting issues last time, and how that went to court. So that can take a long, long, long time. Okay. Questions on these? So RAM evaluation, best. Legal authorization, best. Okay, with these. All right. So on the next part, before we jump to the last question, peer-to-peer file sharing. Now, you know that there's illegal download through peer-to-peer. There's illegal distribution through peer-to-peer. There was a huge case from in the 90s that would trigger all of that, and that comes back to copyright and all of these things that you see today. Okay. And other cases, you do see distribution of illicit images and videos when it comes to child pornography and some of the areas that would get into the criminal area. So there's some investigation with the community, and the FBI and the NSA, they monitor this area quite a bit. Okay. However, you can be contracted to examine a specific profile for a certain user in the peer-to-peer environment. Okay. Now, most of the time now is what we see is that they have to install the application, and with that application, it automatically creates that shared folder, that directory where, you know, and then it would link some of the media-based folder or files to that particular shared folder. Okay. So with this is that what you can do, they recommend that yes, you can look at the hash value for that particular directory or the software, the application that they use, and be able to determine using a forensic tool. Okay. So we have to get it to be a hex value, then we would use some kind of tool to convert that value to something that we would see. As in when they last installed that folder, what kind of files that's going to, and then so once you have more information about that directory, when they created it and when they last updated it, then we can start drilling down on the file, and that becomes easier because now we know we already talked about how to do forensic on file, right? You can use different tools like OS Forensic, Pro Discoverer, a lot of, and then that comes back to the hard drive. So once we have that value, so here it gives you a link to the converter for BitTorrent, which is a popular one nowadays, right? That's just one example. And so you can use that to calculate the hash, because the SHA, the SHA-1, it uses that hash value. And in the past, we did exercises on, even week 1 with Network Miner, you saw how you can convert the hash on that. Okay, so you would use a tool to look at that. So in security, in many areas of security, it's about using the right tool and knowing that tool well. That's all you need. Having the technical knowledge to apply that tool is very important. Okay, big picture. All right. Lastly, I'm just going to touch on a little bit on cloud. We did a lab on Dropbox and OneDrive. You saw how that works. So cloud is broken into these 3 areas: the public, the private, and the hybrid. Okay. Public is for public resources or specific person from that organization, like government, university. So it's accessible to everyone in the public. Okay. Private cloud, something that you would only be given some access or right access to some resources. So for example, I can have a company and I can have private cloud option with AWS or Google or Microsoft. And on it, I can store my company's data, right? So when you took CIS 27 and 25, we touch on different type of cloud technology. I show you how you can use AWS. But you see this, that some company, so when it's private cloud, the company that contract with the cloud company, they are required to maintain 50%. Usually it's 50% or even more in the security portion of it, right? And they would pay the cloud company monthly or yearly on, whether they're using elasticity or they're using like a fixed range of data. So it's important to know that. Why? Because you would know who's gonna legally authorize you to access that data. Okay, so this is gonna be half and half usually, or the company that contracted, that cloud company would give you the authorization. Public, you go back to the cloud company and ask. Okay, then you got the hybrid cloud where it's gonna be both. Okay, so it's made up of 2 or more deployment. So you have software as a service, infrastructure as a service, right? Where they would host their whole network on there, or they would deploy their applications from the cloud, right? Or they would have combinations. So you have a lot of different type of services that would be mixed together, and that could be privately contracted or it could be shared to the public. Okay, so breaking it down to that category, you can narrow down on where you need to look, and that's important. So one of the things that you need to look at is your service level agreement, your SLA. So when you're looking in from a third party, if you contracted as a forensic investigator from the outside, when you're looking into a corporate, you have to see how the SLA is established between them and the cloud company. And that would tell you specifically how the data can be evaluated and accessed and evaluated. Okay, because you would have the limitations stated on how you would acquire the data and how you would investigate the data. Okay, so are we clear on this? Now, also in Europe is a little bit different than us, and it's different than, you know, all the other continents. So Asia is different than Europe, than North America. Also in the United States, different countries have different requirements. So here it says that the European citizen must be notified before their information is accessed. It's because to protect their privacy, so they have different privacy rule, and they must be consented. Okay, even if it's public. So you think, oh, well, it's public information. Yeah, you have to notify them, and you have to get them to consent, so that way you can start doing data acquisition, even if it's public. Okay, so that's a little bit different than us, where, you know, for us, like when it relates to a crime that was committed, the convicted lost their right, and it's, you know, public information, like court information is public. And then, but in Europe, even that, they have to be consented. Okay, so tread that water carefully, read, research, and ask for legal advice. Look up the requirement for legal from different part of the world and be able to implement that with your case. Okay, so in the bachelor area of cybersecurity, likely that you will have a legal class where they talk about legal aspect and practices for IT and security. And that also is get carried into the master and the doctorate program. So you will see that repeatedly. And then by the time that you finish your graduate school, you would know specific rules and the regulation and compliance very well, because they kind of drill that into you. Okay, as they did for me. Okay, so for 25, lastly, that we would obtain court authorization and organization permission to access system information and obtain the image. Okay, and then also I forgot to mention that in Europe, we want to make that note, user must be consented and notified. Okay, so if you want to access their profile and such, you have to notify and get them to consent. That's just safety, so it doesn't come back and hurt you. And that can change too over time, right? As we know that rules and laws get changed in time. So when you revisit this a few years from now, it might be different, right? We might implement that. And I think, you know, part of the union in Europe, they implemented the laws to really, you know, not only protect the organization, but, you know, emphasize more on the individual user. And I wish we have more of that here. We transition to some of that here now. So you do see, you know, a lot of care that goes into privacy. When tech companies started, you know, 20 years, 30, 50 years with some of their products, you didn't see some of that. You didn't see, you know, this is why Facebook, Google had, you know, gotten in trouble, and even Apple had gotten recently in trouble for that. Okay, so you read cases about this all the time, and guess what? There's that investigator that's looking into it, that's fixing the problem or help fixing the problem, or, you know, for litigation purposes. I just watched a seminar recently on cryptocurrency litigation. It's very interesting. And so if you have time, start looking into those things, because that's your, you know, that's your scope right now, right? When you get into the field, that's what you see. Okay. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time left addressing any questions. If you have questions, about 20 minutes or so. If not, you can finish up this assignment and submit it on Canvas. I will update your grade and get through it this week. I will link the lab for you. We did most of the lab for this area already, so I will try to tie this into some of the things that will be interesting for you. And then that will be for Wednesday. Okay. All right, let me double check who's here right now. I got everybody here except for one. So, okay. All right. Do you have any questions for me? Oh, don't forget that I went back and asked them about the survey that they're using for me for my evaluation. So if you missed last session, I mentioned that there's an email that went out. The dean just sent me the same notification this morning. So they had activated the survey from the 17th again, right? And it's gonna go until the 28th. So make sure, if you can, spend a few minutes to complete the survey for me, please. I would appreciate it. And any feedback would be important. You know, it's anonymous, so I won't be able to see who did it. They won't be able to see who did it, but we will get the result, and then we can talk about how I can improve my teaching capability for these type of courses. So please do your survey by the 28th, and I would greatly appreciate it, so you have a little bit more than a week to address that. Okay. And if you want to take a look at, so for spring, I had put in my wish list for them that I wanted to teach CIS27A, which is risk analysis, which address more on how to mitigate the risk, reduce the risk, and some of the technical practice area in that. If you're interested in that, that is part of the security certificate, so security specialist and analyst certificate. So you can address both of them at the same time if you wanted to do that. So that class is essential. Um, I'm submitting some stuff for Cal State. I hope I can make the deadline, but I'll let you know. And then Chris, I didn't get anything back from Foundation. So as I told you, maybe sometime tonight or tomorrow morning, I will send out an email to Jennifer and touch back up and see what's happening with the certification thing that you asked me about.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool. I got a question. What do you recommend me to learn on the side to learn Bash and all that command lines?
So to work better with text editor. So Chris asked me earlier for everybody that he's participated in the NCL, and he saw that he was lacking in some area. And I mentioned that, yeah, we did do some of that, but he can go back and revisit it. So for everybody that's going to get into cybersecurity, it's always good to really understand how to use the terminal better, right? To use text editor. From the Windows side with Bash is to use PowerShell. Get really good at PowerShell. That's going to lead you a long way. Everybody uses PowerShell for Windows environment now to automate things, to look for things, to you know, scan, a lot of things. PowerShell is good. You can even set up automated for like certificate and encryption stuff through shell. So outside of Bash, you need to know the other side too, like Windows, right? Install PowerShell if you don't have it, learn how to use it, learn how to use it with script. That's important. Learn how to incorporate script with Linux using terminal. That's good. know how to read log files, as in text files, and load text files into terminal or command prompt or PowerShell to be able to do that. If you can get a lot of that done, and then you can start looking into, oh, well, I wanted to take a look at errors. So what you should start doing after that is to look at events, right? Like even on your own system, things that application generated, like errors, failed, you know, different types of events, and then looking into those events and how to troubleshoot it or how to detect it. So from, there's two things that we do in security: to detect it and to defend it, right? Now, if you're
Yeah.
looking at red team, that's different. I'm not talking about red team. Worry about blue team first, and then, become a defender first. Once you get good at that, then you can get into the red team. Some people, they want to get into red team, but you have to know how to defend it first in order to really attack it. So so just get really good at those two things. How can you see it and how can you fix it? Those are the only two things. So if you see a problem, like let's say that I look at an event and I see that I have a fatal error, right, in Windows environment or even in Linux environment for a certain application. Look into that error and how can you fix that error, or how can you prevent that error from happening again. And if you can start doing that more regularly, then you will be good. Okay. And it's about, looking at the simple stuff and then translating it to something that you can use in operation. And if you want to get on the networking level, same thing. Look at network traffic, which most of you should be doing, right? Like looking at Wireshark, every single packet to see what you know, and then taking that each of that packet information and apply it. Like where is that coming from? What is it doing? What kind of data is it passing? What can I find out more about this? Right? So you just need to take 5 minutes, capture, start looking at it, and yeah, from there you're gonna get better. Okay. Other questions? I hope I give you some pointers there to start. And just real quick, let me find it for you right now before I let you go. There's somebody that did the training for Wireshark. She's a best friend with, and she wrote a book, but she does Wireshark certifications. So she has this thing called Chappelle University. Let me share screen with you real quick. So if you like Wireshark, if you want to get good at Wireshark, she does a wonderful job. Sometimes she does free seminar. I'll see if I can find some of her training. She put some stuff up for our ICT, but she's been around for a long time. So she's a buddy with the creator for Wireshark. They're like best friends. So she has some training that she does on the side for money, but she did release some of the stuff that's free. And then she hosted some virtual event, and I think they posted it. And then she hosted some stuff that she did for that she scanned on her own. Okay, so what you can do is if you search for Chappelle University, her name is Laura Chappelle, and she might be on some YouTube, but there's some resources that she posts for Wireshark that's very useful. This is on the scale of investigation, and also, so there's some cases that she did, and her hobby is that she's a Starbucks regular, and she sits at Starbucks and she scans people. So, you know, but she's licensed to do this with some of the agencies. So that kind of, that kind of get into some of the gray area. I don't really, she really market some of this based on, she used public traffic to really show stuff. But it really, I don't really promote that because I feel that it's invading privacy. You have no business being there. She tells people that she goes into the airport and she scanned. Yeah, there are a lot of people doing that, but it gets into the gray area of ethics. And you do have people that operates in this area, and sometimes they're authorized to do that. But from a professional standpoint, doing it as a professional, it doesn't always mean that it's good to market as an ethic practice. You see, an ethical practice. So when you watch some of her stuff, right, some of this is in the gray area. I just want to warn you, and this is all for educational purposes only, right? You should get paid to do this professionally. You should not do it, just because you're curious, because it can land you in prison. And I mention it many, many times to my students. Just don't scan your neighbor because you could, right? Because computer violation is a big thing, and if you lose that, you lose a lot of privileges. You lose a lot of things, including your job. So just be careful. But yes, Chappelle University, Laura Chappelle, Wireshark, she has some good resources online. You can check her out. Okay. And then if I can think of other things, I'll mention it next time. All right. If you like, you don't have to type in your name. I already saw who's here, but have a wonderful evening. Enjoy your evening. Stick around if you have questions. I'll stay on until 7. But I will see you here, same channel, same time on Wednesday.
See you next week or Wednesday.
Okay. Bye, Chris. Bye, everybody who's signing off. You're welcome. Have a good one. David, you okay? You have any questions?
What was it on? What you were talking about with Laura Chappelle?
Yes.
You were saying like it is more on the gray area. Now you're emphasizing for people to not do those sorts of things, right? Especially
Well,
including.
you should scan where you're permitted to scan. There
Okay.
are a lot of people that scan like public Wi-Fi places.
And
It's,
is that like a gray area where you're kind
people are
of?
gonna look. It's kind of like how you leave your house open and somebody walk by, they turn their head and they look inside your house. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're gonna run into your house and steal things. It's just they're gonna look. So now what you do with that information is essential, right? Because most people scan for a reason. People scan to attack. They don't scan just because they're curious. So, but when what you do with that information would really branch off on the decision whether it's ethical or unethical. So for her, what she does, one of her job is to scan and monitor FBI agents, and they frequent Starbucks and airports and stuff. So she scanned the airport, so that's okay. But when you start scanning, for fun and start using that information to against the individual, then it becomes illegal.
Oh, like tracking them or
Yeah.
blackmailing them of that sort.
Yeah, intercepting their traffic, impersonating them, that stalking them, that becomes illegal. And
Uh,
so for me is that when you go down that line, be prepared, because you would take 2 paths. There's one path that you don't do anything, and then there's the other path. Curiosity kills the cat, right?
yeah, especially get
So
too
you have,
close.
you have to make the appropriate decision. And what my whole point is, to get paid doing it, and when you get paid, you do it, you sign your agreement on what you should look at, where you should look at, and that way it gives you a scope of what area you should be looking.
Yeah, and then the SLS or the SLA agreement for signing on to like for Laura Chappelle, she was scanning
Y-
for the FBI agents because she was
Right.
contracted to do so, right?
Yeah, she mentioned
Mhm.
briefly that she and sometimes they can't say who they work for, but she did mention that she did have to monitor or investigate one of the case, and that was why she was like that. But she also said that her Sunday hobby is to sit at Starbucks and look at people. Just like how you watch people go by, it's very much like that.
And
Yeah.
then based on what you're filtering, or not filtering, more or less like capturing, is more or less what you're supposed to filter out or supposedly not look at or see on the SLA agreement and then submit it.
Yeah, so when you have a scope to do that, you're only allowed to look at that area. So when your SLA said that, let's say that you can only review one user data, let's say user A, that's all
Mm-hmm.
you're gonna look at. Even if you might be able to see other user, you don't look at the other user. You only look at your scope, your permitted user, because it becomes when you are out, when you have scope creep, when you're outside of your scope, what will happen is that because the other people, they didn't authorize you to look at their data, right? The
Yeah.
company didn't authorize you to look at your data, then you violate your agreement, your contract, and that becomes an issue.
Okay.
Legal issue. They can come back and get you. You can go to jail for things that you don't intend to do. And I think everybody have an intention. If they really want to look, and if they really want to find things, there's an intention.
Exactly. Usually is.
Hmm. So if people say that, oh, I accidentally look at that user account, there's no such thing. You saw the path that we have to get there to look at some of the details in the data. You really have to look to find it, right? It's
Yeah.
not like one of those things that you stumble upon. You don't stumble upon that. You have to really look.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, that makes more sense now.
Okay. All right. So just like I said, make sure they agree to it. Make sure you sign for it. Make sure they sign for it, and you should get paid doing it.
Okay. Perfect. All right.
All right.
And
Okay.
then
Yeah.
one other thing before we go, or before I go, is on the Unit 4 class assignment, I had it done and I completely forgot to submit it. So is there a chance I can also submit that as well?
Yeah,
And
I will reopen that for you right now. So since you said unit 4 in class assignment, right?
yes, that is correct.
Okay. Oh, no, when I click 6. Let me go back. Canvas is a little slow right now. Okay. So unit 4. And the lab, are you okay with the lab for unit 4 now?
I believe I completed it.
Yeah. I think, yeah, you were having questions before. So, okay. So it opened. What I'll do is I will extend the availability until the 25th, which is Sunday. So it gives you a little bit of time just in case.
Okay,
Okay?
yeah, I'll submit it tonight. Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
then once I get those, I will update the grade for you, and I will put in the comment for you.
Okay.
So, all right.
Appreciate it.
Okay. I appreciate it, David. Thanks for catching up.
No problem. It's work in progress.
Yeah, I know. But you know what? We're more than halfway, and before you know it, it ends. So just try to get all of those out of the way so you don't have to worry about it later.
Yeah, exactly. And then another question was about the quiz. I know I didn't feel comfortable enough to do it because, well, firstly, I'm still catching up, and then
Did it
it,
close?
I'm not sure, but I
Let me
believe
check.
there's a timeline on it, but I just didn't feel comfortable enough to do it because I felt like I would have bombed it had I did take it.
I think you can still do it. Let me see. I'm gonna check the availability on it. Yeah, so it's gonna open until the 26th.
Oh, okay, then that's plenty of time.
Yeah, so you have about a week So a week from today, then it's gonna close. So yeah, I opened it even though it was due on the 5th. You can still go in and do it. It's not gonna penalize you for late, however, but it's gonna show on my grade book that it's
Mm-hmm.
late. The only
Okay.
thing that I usually penalize for grade that's late would be assignments and some lab, but you can make that up by doing the extra credit or additional points that we're gonna get throughout the semester. So I have an upcoming quiz too that we will review because and then we would hit the quiz too soon. Okay.
Okay. Appreciate it. Sounds good.
Yeah, so chapter 1 through 5 for quiz 1.
Okay. Got
uh,
it.
okay, all right, David, have a good one. Is there anything else I can do for you?
That was all. The rest of everything else is just on me.
Okay, all right, take care. If you have any questions, drop me a message on Canvas or you can send an email.
All right. Sounds good.
Okay, take care. Bye bye.
You too. Bye bye.